Hi everyone, thanks so much, thanks for your patience. My name is Shumon Basar, I direct Format. Thanks so much for joining us. Thanks to my guests this evening, to Douglas Coupland and to Ulrich Obrist. I'll introduce them more in a short while. If I'd ask you to turn your phones to silent right now, I'd really appreciate that. And if you're going to post anything, which validates our existence, please use the hashtag self-format. So there's a way in which we can track those things. That would be really nice. So let's get started. There are seats at the back. Please, with the benches, if you could scoozy up as much as possible so that everyone can make their way in, that would be really, really nice. Thank you very much. Okay, let's get started. Samuel Beckett once said about James Joyce's work in Progress that form is content and content is form. A few decades later, and Marshall McLuhan declared that the medium is the massage. Inspired by these words, format is about the shape, the different shapes that knowledge takes. What's the grammar of how we know things or feel things? And if there's a hidden politics to presentation, what are they? So this is the 8th issue of Format. I think of it as a live magazine. These are the different topics and themes that we've dealt with over the last 7 issues. 2 years ago, we dealt with the couple format, what brings couples together, what tears them apart, what makes them work, what sort of this relationship between love and work in particular. Then last year we looked at the power format, and in particular we were asking if power is becoming something more or less visible in the contemporary moment, and also where is power moving from and where is it moving towards. And in a way, that's also the bigger backdrop of the topic for this issue, which is focusing on the unit of the self, or the self format. So here are a few questions that we keep asking ourselves again and again over the different sessions. What are the historic sources of the self? Why did Adam Curtis describe the 20th century as the century of the self? And importantly, what has become of the self at this point in the 21st century, where data capitalism is poised as the dominant economic, technological, and political framework for generations to come? Where do you begin? Where do you end? Do you crowdsource? Do you selfie? Do you make sure you never selfie? Who knows you best, your family or your data? And have you tried uploading your soul? I'm really very, very excited and very touched that my 2 guests have been able to join me this evening, because it's actually a kind of experiment for us. It's a crowdsourcing experiment for us. It's the first time that we're going to be sharing some research in progress, the beginnings of a conversation that we're having that go towards our next collaborative book and exhibition project, which is called The Extreme Self. And in a way, The Extreme Self is season 2 to season 1, and season 1 was a book that we published with Penguin a few years ago called The Age of Earthquakes, A Guide to the Extreme Present. And so the Extreme Self, The Age of You, hopefully will be out towards the end of next year, and also an exhibition at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Toronto. So to my first of my 2 guests, let me just to here, okay. On paper, Douglas Coupland is a Canadian novelist, a visual artist and designer. He's published 14 novels, including Generation X, All Families Are Psychotic, Girlfriend in a Coma, and the last novel, Worst Person Ever. That was the last novel,
yes.
Correct? Yeah. a collection of short stories, many non-fiction books, and a number of dramatic works and screenplays for film and television. He's currently working on a new TV show. Doug studied sculpture at Emily Carr College in Vancouver, then went to the European Design Institute in Milan. Was it during or just after the Memphis period?
It was almost at the height of Memphis. It was so exciting. And I went to this design school and like, oh my God, I get to maybe be a part of this. And all the teachers like, that Memphis stuff is crap. You have to learn classical design. And I was like, oh God, is this really happening? Okay.
They knew nothing. They
were on the wrong side of history.
They were on the wrong side of history.
Okay.
After Milan, Doug went to the Hokkaido College of Art and Design in Sapporo, Japan, where he also completed courses in business, science, industrial design, and, if I'm not incorrect, ikebano, the Japanese art of flower arranging.
Absolutely.
Correct.
It was mandatory. Yeah.
Mandatory. So, a bit like Hans Ulrich, who we'll get to shortly, Doug's achievements are really too many to mention, but I picked out a few random ones here. So, of course, he's introduced neologisms like Generation X and Muck Jobs into the cultural consciousness. He consulted Steven Spielberg on how the future should look in the sci-fi masterpiece Minority Report, which I watched recently again, and it still holds up. It's really fantastic. It's beautiful to look at, but also beautiful to think about. He's been the artist in residence at the Google Cultural Laboratory in Paris, and recently opened 2 huge installations at the Vancouver Aquarium and the Ottawa Art Gallery, which we're going to discuss shortly this evening. He's been a unique inspiration to many people for many years. Also, interestingly, and I think importantly, to many artists that Hans Ulrich has grown up with, and last but not least, has been a huge inspiration to me. So, will you please join me in welcoming Douglas Coupland? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Two observations about the self that happened this afternoon. At one point, I was at the table and I was working on something, and I got into one of those arguments with myself. Well, we should do this, but I can't do that. But you have to do this because and I realized, okay, which one of those was me? And when you have that kind of argument, where's the actual you in the part of all that? The other observation is that we're even discussing this here tonight in London in the year 2018. The notion that we are all collectively changing is absolutely new in human history. I think even if you go back to the 60s, you said society was changing, but people weren't changing. In the 70s, the world's changing, but not people. But now we all very intensely know that we're all changing on the inside. The 20th century was all about things that made the world bigger. Barbed wire, elevators, radio, the automobile, and everything about the 21st century is about what happens inside your head and shrinking it, making it morph and change. And if nothing else, I will say that in my lifetime, the perception of time passing has morphed incredibly. I'm looking at the audience here. I have this old chestnut I pulled out, which is that I don't remember my pre-internet brain, and most of you don't have a pre-internet brain. And I think you have a Darwinian advantage over me. Curse you.
Sorry, I just want to, actually that's really interesting because Hans Ulrich, you knew Jg Ballard when he was in the last years of his life in particular. Something that Jg Ballard said even as early as the 60s, and certainly in the 70s, was that early space travel, or the conquest that man was achieving was the conquest of outer space. So the space race, of course, and how that plays within the Cold War. But then he said there was a shift taking place, and that the future was really about inner space. And that kind of almost predates or pre-echoes, it's a precognition of what Doug is saying. Did you ever discuss this inner space with Jg Ballard?
Yeah, he talked about that, and actually he talked about that move exactly from sort of outside to inside, because we worked on this project at the time. The future is ... and he wrote some formulas for that, and he sent us also to the Hilton in Heathrow. He was his favorite building. So for those of you who haven't been to the Hilton in Heathrow, it's very awkward. So
it's the most nothing building in the world.
Yes.
Really, yeah.
Who has been to the Hilton in Heathrow?
I've actually.
So anyways, in terms of architecture, it's Jg Ballard's favorite building. So
you must all go there. What we wanted to do, maybe to get things going this evening, was talk about a kind of what seems to have been an unconscious preoccupation in Dough's work, particularly as a visual artist. Although I'm also curious how that will map on, or how it maps on to your work as a writer and as a fiction writer in particular. But it occurred to me that looking over the last 20 years of Dough's output, he has been consistently returning to the human body, and then increasingly more and more to the question of the human face. And particularly within what we call the conditions of the extreme present. So what we've done is sort of put together a story of selected projects, selected sculptures, artworks, public installations that deal with this. And I think at each time they bring up really interesting and salient points about the question of the self, what the self used to be, and perhaps the direction that it's going towards next. So I thought we'd start here. For you to go to West Vancouver, at the end of a kind of cul-de-sac, you would not see Dough's house because it's camouflaged by...
It's designed to not show up on Google Street.
It does not show up on Google Street. But if you to sort of work your way through the thicket, you discover extremely beautiful, interesting modernist villa. René Thom, is that right?
Ron Thom.
Ron Thom, from 1960, is that right? And a lot of the inspiration came from Japanese, a certain trickle down of Japanese influences through West Coast modernism, of course, case study houses. And if you were to go through the official front door, this is what you would see. And you would enter into an extraordinary space, a house that is also a kind of museum, a house that is a collection, a house that's a collection of obsessions, and a house that's ultimately also, as Doug described it to us once, effectively the inside of his brain. Hans-Ulrich, we went there together for the first... I'd been before. You went for the first time a few years ago. What was your impression when you first walked into Dough's house?
Yeah, I mean, it was an extraordinary evening, because we started first to record a conversation, and then William Gibson arrived. And Doug, it was sort of the beginning of the 3D printing.
Yes.
It was just, started to be available easily to have a 3D printer at home. And I think we printed out some hats in your house. I think William...
We're going to show them in a minute.
William Gibson's hat. That's my strongest memory. But also, talking about memories, but also, of course, the house is a kind of an extraordinary Gesamtkunstwerk, in that, amazing, and there's so many connections there to London, when we think about, the Sir John Soane's house.
Or Madelon's house.
Or Madelon's house. Or if you think also about Charles Chang's house, which is about to become a museum. So I think the house that Doug built, the house that Doug built is very much a Gesamtkunstwerk.
Gesamtkunstwerk.
Yeah.
So then, okay, so Doug, we're going to start here. So maybe you could tell us what these are and when they happened and what they tell us about.
Another strange thing that happened earlier today was Shumon said, you've done an awful lot of portrait work. I'm like, portrait work? Seriously? And then he showed me, I guess I have done.
Yes, you have.
And you can be very clueless for very long. High school in North America, I think, is a much more psychically charged event for people than it is here in Europe, I think. And I was born on almost the last day of the year, so I was always the youngest person in my grade. And when I entered high school, I was the youngest person out of 1,200 students, and I had to figure out how I was going to survive. And so I became like the smart kid. And school's not hard. It's like anyhow, but
You figure it out.
the trauma of being the smallest and tiniest kid in the school really sort of stuck with me for a long time. So later, this is about 2000 here, working with portraiture and defacement in the way that we all take this thing called the high school yearbook, and that you put horns on people's heads, you deface them in various ways. Did I click forward here?
Yeah.
Oh, we seem to have skipped one. Hang on. Okay, so we'll come back to this theme. Another thing that's happened, I have this weird accidental career doing monuments and representational sculpture in North America, which is this thing that's like a UFO that landed inside my life. Here, this is the National Firefighters Memorial in Ottawa, Canada, and it's about 18 feet tall, and it has a very extraordinary large male face, and this is important because we're going to come to something that feeds off of that. That we were unsure to make what would a generic male face look like? So we got a G.I. Joe doll and sort of modeled a real face after the fake G.I. Joe. And so time goes on. In Toronto, there was an event called Nuit Blanche, which is about 600,000 people in one night going through massive amounts of installations. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing. And I did this project called the Museum of the Rapture in the civic parking lot beneath City Hall Square. And that was just taking faces and just like, boom, like when they vanish, who vanishes and who stays. And then in recent years, this has gone into this weird thing of facial recognition. And a photograph is no longer a photograph. A photograph used to be this thing that went through a lens and put onto paper that you looked at and then maybe gave to someone else. And a photograph is now this thing that's like maybe 2 million bits of information that goes into a cloud that's infinitely searchable for the next trillion years for all we know, but it's not a photograph anymore. And so how do you enter this process and how do you stay out of it? And here we are back in high school again, and basically photography like this, it's industrial photography. And the people in our high school photographs are about as unique as cows going through a butcher in Chicago, feed yards, what have you. And then we have facial recognition, which has really gone to an extraordinary level at this point. And these are just various systems and how they work here. Facebook has made it its official goal to identify every face ever put on Facebook. Like, they will do it someday, which I'm sort of shocked by and horrified by. And I'm just very glad I grew up in an era that didn't have that stuff. And these are various ways of looking at people. In the bottom corner, there's Jigaloo, this insane clown posse.
Yes.
And just various ways of changing the visual look of yourself to make you undetectable down the road. And these are some very, very simple pieces, just taking portraiture and how much can you obscure it to make this person no longer recognizable by any known system, whether now or in the future. And these, I'm actually told by friends down there, these people would be very quickly found. And I thought, really? So it's...
But Doug, there's obviously already a pattern here. There are existing faces, and then you're blocking them.
Yeah.
And at the beginning, I mean, the first pictures you showed us, 2002, 2003.
Yeah.
So that predates the ubiquity of face recognition. And same with the image that you showed from Nuit Blanche, which the performance was called the Rapture. But it's interesting that this preoccupation of either effacing or disfacing the face predates facial recognition and then continues through facial recognition. What is it about faces that you don't want us to see?
I believe that the right to be forgotten is an essential human right, and that there seems to be no way to get around that. That we no longer have that essential human right. And I think I was maybe nostalgic before this thing is pre-nostalgia for something that had yet to happen. This is just in the studio, this is various other pieces. And there we have some close-ups. In 2000, Pierre Huyghe came to Vancouver and we did a project together where we had a stack of maybe 50 or 60 high school yearbooks. And we went through them and we took out the photos of all the freaks and weirdos that you find in any high school class, like the goth and the druggie and all that. We put them together and made a book which was about a ghost of someone, this girl had gone to high school and talking about sort of the inner dreams of recognition, of being photographed, of being identified. This is general, unknown, unfindable. So I thought at the time, you could find this guy in a flash.
You did an artist book with Pierre, no? Because I was actually the other day, came across this, you co-authored a book. Can you tell us about that?
Well, okay. He wanted to do a collaboration with someone, Pierre, but he didn't know what it was going to be. And so he came to Vancouver and came to the house. I mean, he looked through the house and everything, and I'm not quite sure if it's working. And then he said, what's that pile over there? That's my collection of high school yearbooks. And it was like, and then we got out the X-Acto blades and the scissors, and we just started this big project. And I mean, he says that to Europeans, like North American high school with cheerleaders and football players, it's like a mythology, like Greek mythology. And it doesn't exist in Europe, and it's maybe more exotic there than it is where I come from. It was a very happy experience. I would never have looked at imagery that way if it had not been for him.
Doug, can I just ask you about faces when you're writing?
Yeah.
And so, the group of characters, for example, in Generation X, have, very precise personalities. Do you picture their faces of characters when you're writing?
Here's something I've consciously, since the beginning of writing fiction, is I've never assigned race to any character ever in any of my books. And so there's once, but it was for a specific geographical thing. But everyone says, all your characters are white. Like, why do you do that? And actually, if you go back and read there's not one single mention there of race. So I think that's also something that's like imposed on you because people know I'm like a white middle class guy from the west coast of North America. And that's always been an ongoing silent project. So it's something that does happen. Okay, so here we have the bust. Okay, so about 8 years ago, I had to do a project and I had to get a scale model built, a maquette. And it was about that big, and they said it's $4,000. And I said, that's crazy, it's like $4,000. And then someone else said, well, why don't you just go and buy a machine and print it yourself? And I, no, that machine must surely cost $10,000. No, it's actually only $2,000 at that point in history. So I bought it, got the maquette for half price, and had a free 3D printer at the end of it. And I mean, that was then. Now they're about $199. They're essentially free. And the filament you use to print out is also essentially free. It's not expensive like toner cartridges. And so that's a scan of myself. And all future iPhones and Androids are going to have scanners built into them. And so basically where I scan you, Hans-Ulrich, I would hold this up, circle you, and got it. and then I own you in 3 dimensions. And I did a project in Vancouver, or in Canada, which we'll get to shortly. But what happens with 3D printing is you print people out. You have a scan, and we did these public scans, and you'd have fathers that were being dragged along by their kids saying, I don't want to scan. What the hell is a scan? Why are we even here? This is so stupid. Dad, just sit in the chair and we're going to take your scan. And so while you're being scanned, there's a computer screen that shows what you look like as it's going through. And then suddenly you go around to the back of the head, and it's like being in a mirror and suddenly going to the back of the mirror. It's like, what is that thing? I want one. How much do they cost? How do I do it? And they actually became the biggest evangelists for the format. This is a learning experience for me. I think this was 3 years ago. The 3 of us were having lunch, and why don't we get ourselves doobed? I think D-O-O-B-E-D. Let's get duplicated. So we took a cab to this place, a maker shop on Clerkenwell Road, and you go in this booth, and they have 251 single
DSLR cameras.
SLR cameras.
So, yeah.
And you walk into the booth and do a pose, and boom, it's done. And so this is me inside that booth, and I'm doing all these guy things, like I'm sucking in my gut like crazy there. And then 6 weeks later, this thing arrives on your doorstep, and it's pigmented. And ever since this thing arrived at my door, I've been going to the gym 3 or 4 days a week. So you learn those things about you. You were there, you got yours. What was it like when you opened up your doob and you saw it?
No, it was kind of strange because at that time we worked on a show with Duane Hansen at the Serpentine. I kind of made me think of that because, of course, the kind of hyper-realism of Duane Hansen. I thought all of a sudden, wow, if every visitor who would come and see the Duane Hansen show could all of a sudden get their own sculpture. That remained an unrealized project, but that was the first thing which came to my mind.
Oh, yeah. I love Duane Hansen. Okay.
But I think the first time I got scanned, I think it was the same time you got scanned.
That was after the William Gibson story.
Well, yes, because this is...
That looks so heroic.
We got scanned here, yeah, and then so this is what Hans Ulrich was talking about. This was extraordinarily 21st century day. Hans Ulrich had just interviewed William Gibson, the inventor of the cyberspace, of Neuromancer, and the kind of prophet of our dystopian future. Hans Ulrich did an amazing interview with Bill in Doug's living room, and then while that was happening in the other room, here on the right, Bill's very first 3D printed bust was being printed. And then we went to dinner at a friends of Doug's, and Doug had very kindly brought in Oculus headsets. And then this is Bill Gibson trying Oculus for the very first time
while his
head is being printed down the road. It was really extraordinary.
You tried it, right?
Yeah.
Did you try VR?
Yeah, many times.
And we're going to digress. I better get going here.
No, I go for it. What are you going to ask him?
Well, was it a wow experience? What was your experience?
No, for me, the best experience, the kind of most complex experience so far with VR was when I went to meet Inarritu at the Prada Foundation last year, and we spent a day with Inarritu, and then, it was before the thing had opened, and then we experimented with his, installation, and of course that, in a way, is so multi-sensory, because you had to take off your shoes, you walked on sand, all of a sudden, he worked with NASA. So it went far beyond the idea of just you having these goggles. It became this very physical experience. And then you basically would be, with a group of people who would try to cross the borderline between Mexico and the United States. And, all of a sudden a police helicopter approaches, and, there is wind from this helicopter. And it really, you're basically with these people, you're with this group. And and you're literally not sure if you should throw yourself as well on the floor. It becomes this, this very strange thing that you lose at a certain moment. You're no longer sure if it's real or not real or all of that. And I think it had a lot to do with the fact that this was kind of a total installation. It went clearly beyond. But I think in terms of curating, I felt it very limited because, we're doing exhibitions in order to kind of create junctions, not only between objects, but also between people. And it's very sad when you're in an exhibition and then some people disappear with these goggles, in some kind of solipsistic isolation, right? I find it very depressing. And so I think in a way, the question will be how we can go beyond that, because of course, and that leads us to augmented reality, how we can actually have that experience and at the same time see each other, etc., etc. Yeah. So I think that's when it will become interesting for curating. But I think there are moments already now when it's interesting. So for example, when we did the Zaha Hadid show, I had this last conversation with Zaha just about 2 or 3 weeks before she so sadly passed away, and we were discussing about her drawings because she gave her last lecture, the RIBA lecture, when she received this prize, and then encouraged all her friends to come, and it was somehow an incredible lecture where she sort of, the AA played a very important role in it, her beginnings at the AA, but also went further back to calligraphy, to Baghdad, was a lot about Rem Koolhaas also, and it was basically really the whole story. She made one lecture where she told everything, and in that lecture, all of a sudden, these ink drawings popped up, these calligraphic drawings, and it was so strange because you suddenly realized that she had done these calligraphic drawings actually before she had ever been in contact with anything digital, done them. So this sort of super fluidity grew out of calligraphy, really. And I texted her that same night after the lecture, saying, kind of incredible, it's the most incredible thing I've seen in a long time. I need to see more of these drawings. So we went to her house, and she never had brought these drawings to her office. They were basically under her bed, they were in a cupboard, They were really like her treasure, and they were also like where she had developed all the idea, all the reservoir of ideas. So we decided to make an exhibition, which then, so very sadly, we could no longer do with her, but which we did, posthumously at the Serpentine with about all these drawings. And then we worked with Google on a VR project, because obviously it seemed very interesting if you look at Zaha's drawings and paintings to all of a sudden think, you can extrapolate this actually into a VR space. And that was very interesting because it didn't by any means, take anything away from the experience of the show, because you could only experience these drawings when you were physically there, but you could then have yet another experience. So it was almost like a parallel reality. It's like in quantum physics, you add another layer, But when you go to an exhibition and you have only got the VR, the other day I was in Berlin and I was a VR show and there was a queue, and everybody was kind of waiting for the goggles in a queue, and whilst they were in the queue they didn't see anything. That's for me as a curator really difficult, which leads us then to Ian Chang, but that's for later.
I didn't know about the drawings. That kind of reminds me of Andy Warhol, who did all the illustration drawings in the 50s and then put them under his bed forever and did his other work. So,
and maybe I just want to bring up someone that we were discussing yesterday, Jaron Lanier, and his recent book, which is about virtual reality. And he's obviously one of the pioneers at Microsoft for the last 30 years thinking about VR. But one of the things he says in this new book, which is quite provocative. He says many things, but one of the provocative things he says is that at its best, VR may be able to inculcate empathy. Now, empathy is something we were talking about with Sophia Almeria a couple of days ago. Sophia brought it up as perhaps one of the most, one of the last defining qualities that continue to perhaps distinguish what it means to be human and what it might mean to be machine, right? So, at which point does the privilege of empathy stop being something that only we have? And Lanier says that one of the things driving the format of the novel, the birth of particularly the English-speaking and the French-speaking novel in the 18th century, were that they were kind of empathy machines. right? So there's something, and actually even, and much, much later, this is what David Foster Wallace would say, that what fiction allows you to do is literally enter someone else's consciousness. And entering someone else's consciousness that's what empathy is, right? So it's to other yourself and become someone else. And Lanier sort of says, well, this is potentially what, VR can do, but I'm also slightly skeptical because I find that, and any of you who've seen the recent Steven Spielberg film, which is nowhere near as good as Minority Report, Ready Player One, will know that the premise there is you kind of extrapolate this way into the future to its kind of like terminus point, and everyone is literally only living in their headset, And so what kind of crowd do you get when we're all living in our own headset, right? So, I mean, or is this a new form of empathy? Or is it actually the absolute destruction of empathy, So anyway, Doug, perhaps we can keep going.
Okay. So this is Gumhead. At this point, I've been doing ever larger heads, and so finally, for Vancouver to show there, we made this 8-foot tall head of me. And the idea was for people to come by and put their chewing gum on it, and then it would sort of take on its own patina and life. And this was in summer of 4 years ago. And fortunately for myself, every morning the Wrigley chewing gum van would show up right beside it. And over the summer, it gave out about 250,000 pieces of chewing gum, which people put on the head. A few things I learned. People go for the eyes first, the mouth second, ears third, bindi spot fourth, everything else fifth. And at the end of it, we washed away about 45 pounds of chewing gum. It was really disgusting. This was another staging of it in Toronto a few months after that. And then people actually became very proprietary about where they put their gum, and they would drive by it on Howe Street to make sure it was still there weeks later. And the Gumhead goes to Brasilia, to this Oscar Niemeyer building somewhere there.
Doug, what was it like when you first... So who was the first person to stick gum on your head for the first time?
Oh, it was just like The Simpsons, Mayor Quimby. It was Mayor Robertson of Vancouver put the first inaugural piece of gum on. The thing about defacement, it means not taking yourself quite so seriously. That before digital manipulation, all you really had was the real world Bic pens and gum and the sorts of things that teenagers do to destroy any sort of surface. It was going to be put in Tribeca in New York, and then it got shut down by the New York Health and Science. So it was about joy, I think. Gumhead was just all about the joy of being human. It really, I don't know if it went any deeper than that. Okay, so this is a self-portrait of Vincent van Gogh, done by himself, because it's a self-portrait. And a friend of mine owns a vineyard up in central British Columbia, and we wanted to start an ongoing series of commissioned works to go in the space. And how do you express terroir, the thing that's in the soil that gives any wine its magic, whether this side of the street's terrible, that side's amazing, what have you. And I thought of the DNA mutation of the redhead, which is about 1.5% of the world's population, which is about the amount of cultivated grapes that make Pinot Noir. So I wanted a great big sculpture of Vincent van Gogh's head, maybe listening to soil to hear what's going on in the soil, but how do you make that meaningful in the 21st century? So we had this global contest of find Vincent van Gogh's lookalike, and it took on this crazy viral life of its own. We had just over 10,000 unique entrants, and it went really crazy in Holland, England, Scotland, Ireland, you can imagine, and Norway. And we had one point, we had the head of the Norwegian ultra right-wing party was the winning, because everyone had to vote as well online, and you can't let him win, he's a fascist. And so, and we kept on getting entrant. It was a lot of fun, actually. And you realize there's a lot of people out there who look like Vincent van Gogh. And then this was the winner.
This is the winner.
Oh, Dan, he lives in Christchurch, England.
Of course he's called Dan.
Dan. And he showed up and it was just like, it was chilling. He was wearing Don't Fear the Reaper.
Smock?
Who did Don't Fear the Reaper, the song?
Oh,
Blue Oyster Cult. He comes out of the airport van wearing a Blue Oyster Cult t-shirt, and it's like, it's Vincent van Gogh. It really was him. And so we made this massive casting of his head. This was done in an upstate New York, the same place where Jeff Koons gets his Play-Doh sculptures made out of cast aluminum, and I had to sign a non-disclosure agreement. I could never tell anyone what I saw there, but I can show you this. It was this aluminum's wonderful. You get this amount of detail that you can't get in any other 3D form.
It's funny because Julian Schnabel just shot this Van Gogh movie,
Yes.
in art.
Did you really?
Yeah, with Willem Dafoe, who plays Van Gogh.
Really?
Came to my mind seeing these doppelgangers.
He makes good movies, so that's okay.
He just finished it. It's gonna launch, I think, in a few months. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, yeah.
Actually, sorry, I just wanted to ask the audience. I'm wondering whether all of us have a celebrity or famous person that we either think we look like or we're told we look like. Who here has been told they look like someone famous? Natasha, who are you?
I was Gillian Anderson.
Gillian Anderson from The X-Files.
Correct.
Who else? You?
Chris Martin.
Sorry?
Yes.
Chris Martin.
Chris Martin. Hell yeah.
Okay.
Don't need to fix you. Anyone else? Anyone else? Yes?
Any different people? Kirsten Dunst, maybe?
I can
Kirsten
see that.
Dunst. Yeah, we got that.
Shumon, Prince.
More recently, George Clooney. But yeah, since Prince died, I'm happy to carry the mantle. Spirit.
There's this guy, a Chilean naval battle winner, Arturo Prat, who's on the Chilean 10,000 peso note, and I look just like him. And I go to Chile for about a month every year, and everywhere I go to buy something, everyone's like giggling and laughing. And then I put this thing on Twitter saying like, it's an honor to be here in Chile, home of my great-grandfather Arturo. And within 2.5 seconds, it started going viral in Chile, and I had to like, stop it right now, stop it right there.
Hans Ulrich, anyone? You're constantly mistaken for yourself, I believe.
No, I once met actually someone who is doing, is finding doppelgangers, and I thought it could be kind of fun if she would find a doppelganger of mine, who could go and do my lectures. And then we made a casting, but it didn't work at all.
The hunt is on.
It was a failed experiment.
This is for the Armory show 2 years ago. There was like this giveaway thing with Artsy. So speaking of that,
There's a great book by there's this American artist who made a book about everybody in the art world and their doppelganger.
Really?
Yeah.
I don't know this.
It is. I'm gonna find the name of
Okay.
the artist. It's a great artist book about 100 people, and he found a doppelganger for everyone.
Oh, you've got a Warhol thing going, you know that. Okay. So Shumon, what is this? Tell us about this.
So, I'm sure many of you will recognize this. This was from earlier this year, January. Google's Facematch app, which is technically only available in the US at the time, but there were ways of hacking into it. But on the surface, it's a bit of fun and frippery, right? So you have your face scan, then it basically scours through Google, the Google Art and Culture kind of database of all the portraits that they've scanned from museums, collections all around the world, and then again through what Doug was talking about, through kind of mapping facial recognition. It will tell you who the closest face match is from the history history of art. And this, this was like the hot thing for about a week in January, if you remember. And I mean, this one of Ed Sheeran on the right, I think is pretty good. Although it says only 49%, I think that's a bit cruel. But what's interesting, again, is basically the technology that's behind this, right? The sort of everything that's being done in the background to make this being able to happen instantly, right? So the minute you scan your face, then suddenly within a split second, it's able to throw back something that often looks remarkably kind of like you. And then that goes back to what Doug was saying about Facebook's sort of dream of having all of our faces scanned.
Yeah.
So is it Google's dream then to have all of the faces of art history scanned as well? And so the right to remain, what did you just, the right to remain anonymous or forgotten, the right to remain forgotten, clearly will no longer be, will no longer be a right.
Well, I mean, everyone thinks that you are your face, you become your face, or you end up with the face that you deserve. So much of our self is wrapped up in the face. But there's all these, there's facial recognition, is your fingerprint, your fingerprints, there's your retina. But one of the things that people don't realize is actually more of themselves than anything else is the way that you walk. And your gait, G-A-I-T, your gait as you walk. And it tells more about the right sensors than anything else will. And so airports around the world are being reconfigured so that when you come in from an international flight and you get in the lineup and they stop and they say, next you go to number 17, they're actually recording your gait as you walk on the floor over to gate 17. And that way, boom, they've got your walk in the system. And that you maybe didn't even know that. So that's another form of information you had no idea you were giving away. Okay, this is like I hate this picture, May, so I'm gonna go ahead. So this is 20 feet by 20 feet, and this is sort of a culmination of 3 years of scanning thousands of heads across Canada, and then printing them out at going from like 2 inches up to 3 feet high, and then arranging them in sort of almost like a garden-like formation. And what's happening here is that for the first time in history, you can be absolutely promiscuous with the third dimension. That bust hell, I've got 50 of them, I've got 200 of them, and you can just go in there and just blast through them, and then you take I think there's another shot in here. You take each of the heads and you distort them anamorphically. So that as you walk around it, it reveals itself in correct perspective, then it distorts over it again. So in my mind, this is a sort of a celebration of a technology going from very, very corporate and proprietary into being absolutely democratic and available anywhere on Earth for, honestly, $99. It's free at this point, it really is. And then we are gonna have this, after 20 years of JPEGs and 20,000 pictures on your iPhone, not one of which ever gets printed out, we're going to have solid bowls filled with heads all over your kitchen, your living room. The thing about 3D is that everyone makes things. They don't actually just look at them, they actually make them and live with them. And as they used to deface photographs back in high school, they put antlers and horns and things sticking out of the ears, what have you. So same old thing, brand new drag. Oh, during the entire scanning process, 9 cities, all we wanted was a mohawk. And then we didn't get one mohawk ever coming to any of the events. And finally, in Halifax, Nova Scotia, we were saying oh, what a tragedy, we never got a mohawk. And this woman's like, my boyfriend's got a mohawk, I'll get him here. And really? And he was at home, he's playing some like massively online role-playing game or whatever. And no, you have to come do this. I don't want to do it. So he says fuck, I'm here, just take my scan or whatever it is. And he was the last one of the whole series, was the mohawk. Yeah. Wow. So there's a story there. Okay, so Facebook, your friend. There's a lot of money to be made in identifying every face ever put on Facebook or the internet. I'm a little bit mistrustful. I think in the end, a lot of these people, they're technocrats, they're technicians. one thing I've noticed when you're in any tech environment, like in the Valley or in Boston or whatever, and they see you coming and they know you're not 100% a technician, like, hi, do you ever think about what people are going to do with your technology? And they just like cringe inside, like, no, I have my benchmarks, my milestones, I make them, and I don't want to think about it. And there was finally, I had this one person who was honest. It was in a tech park in Canada, Ontario, Canada. And he said, you know what, sometimes I get kind of sad that I go to all this work so that people can have a reasonably satisfying online pornography experience at the $29.95 price point. And I think the big golden fleece right now in the tech world is taking VR, marrying that with porn and gaming, and then like, boom, we're off to the next level of humanity. I think this has to be the last image.
Yeah.
There we go.
Please thank Douglas Coupland. So, okay, we're going to move swiftly on to our second guest, who equally could be argued also doesn't need introducing. But any of you who've not heard of Ulrich Obrist, he is artistic director of the Serpentine Galleries here in London. And I just want to mention two things that, amongst many, many things that I think are remarkable achievements over his tenure at the Serpentine. One is the growth, the continued development and sort of redefinition of the Serpentine Summer Pavilion project. The Frida Escobardo is on now. You must all go and see it. Secondly is the Serpentine Marathon, annual marathon, which happens every October. It started in 2006 as a 24-hour interview marathon, and it was also kind of surfed over incredible topics, including miracles. Last time I was looking at also Ghosts in the Machine, poetry, and it goes on and on and on. And I think it really is one of the most ambitious and also one of the most successful formats of staging discourse and ideas in the world today. Interestingly, it just occurred to me today, after all these years, which is strange, that you curated your first exhibition, or first notable exhibition, World Soup, the kitchen show, in 1991. And that's when Generation X also came out.
Wow, 20.
So, you know, in effect, there's the 1991 is also kind of ground zero for both Doug and Ulrich. Since then, he's curated more than 300 exhibitions. He's also conducted over 2,500 hours of interviews with the world's most important thinkers and makers. And in my humble opinion, it really is one of the great intellectual archives of the 20th and 21st centuries. I won't even try to list the publications for Ulrich because he is a book machine. But I will mention that he's working on a new book right now about daily rituals. And this reflects his own numerous performative practices that have in the past included drinking 18 cups of espresso in the morning, at least, maybe up to 20 or more than 20. Not sleeping more than 15 minutes at a time. Every morning he wakes up and reads some poetry by Etel Adnan. For the last 10 or 12 years, every time Ulrich sees me, he tells everyone in the room, whether it's a restaurant or a gallery or an art fair, that it's my birthday, and gets them all to sing happy birthday for me, except on my real birthday, when I don't hear from him. So he effectively makes sure it's my birthday for the whole year round, and I'm very grateful for that. And now, he told us yesterday that his newest ritual is as soon as he embarks on a plane, and you're greeted by an air steward or an air stewardess, he immediately tells them that, actually, maybe Ulrich, you should tell us, what do you tell the air steward as soon as you get on there?
It's an idea of Ben Vickers, the artist, who's the amazing, chief technology military officer at the Serpentine, and amazing writer. And Ben Vickers told us about this other kin movement, when people really imagine to be a rock, or they imagine to be a flower, or, and it can change. So it's kind of nice when you enter a plane or you arrive somewhere and you just, say, hi, good morning, I'm a rock, or, hi, good morning, I'm a flower. It's worthwhile trying it out. Leads to very interesting situations, particularly on planes.
Particularly, I don't recommend it. Not if you want the plane to take off, clearly. He has many, many mottos, many of which have now been turned into rubber stamps, and I have a number of them. But I think the one that that stays with me, and probably stays with many, many people that know Hans Ulrich, is don't stop, don't stop, don't stop, don't stop. He is undoubtedly a singular living example of the extreme self. Will you please join me in welcoming Hans Ulrich Obrist?
Thank you so much, Shumon, and I'm going to be brief because I think what will be particularly interesting will be also that we find some time to talk a little bit maybe about this book we are writing, no? Because I was thinking it could be interesting because we're not exactly yet sure where we are going with this, second volume of The Extreme Present, and I think it's kind of interesting to talk about the book publicly where one doesn't really know where it goes. It's kind of part of the process. It's such an unusual thing. I mean, 2 is a company, 3 is a crowd, and of course there have been many, constellations where 2 people write the book together. I mean, I've always been inspired by Deleuze, Guattari, and all of that, but I think it's a very amazing, I mean, for me, it's an amazing experience, this process of ours to write together, and maybe it'll be interesting to talk a little bit afterwards about this methodology, which in a way seems to work, because it works again now for that second volume, and there is no end in sight, and it's become a kind of a triple book machine of some kind of way. But Shumon wanted me to talk about a few things. So I'm going to talk about Sandra Perry, which I think connects to this theme. But before that, just a few words on Frida Escobedo. I think it's interesting when Doug before was talking about this, right to be forgotten. It also made me think about the right to opacity in a way, which in the current, world situation seems to be important. And that, of course, brings us back to Edouard Glissant, which is, one of my rituals. It's that I read him every day, and I recommend you vividly to read Edouard Glissant, because he's really an extraordinary toolbox for architects and artists and writers, for everyone in a way, because he's this extraordinary figure from Martinique, whom I met at the Café de Flore through my friend Agnes B. And ever since we met, until, he died in his 80s a couple of years ago. For the last 10 years of his life, he would speak like every couple of weeks, and he became my mentor. And I think it's very interesting if we talk about the self, because he talked often about the self, as an archipelago and not as a continent. And I think that's really interesting, because I think it ties in also very much with what Doug was saying, this idea about change, and about us being many, this idea of it being, an archipelago, because he says he, of course, came from Martinique, so he came from the American, archipelago, and he says the American archipelagos are extremely important because it was in these islands that the idea of creolization, that is the blend of cultures, was most brilliantly fulfilled. He said continents reject mixings, whereas archipelago thought, or we could maybe in English call it archipelic thought, I don't know if that word exists, archipelic thought, it makes it possible to say that neither each person's identity nor the collective identity are fixed and established once and for all. And that brings us then to the very key message, of Edouard Glissant's universe, which is that I can change through the exchange with the other without losing or diluting my sense of self. And so in that sense, it's what archipelic thought teaches us. And I think in the current, world situation where we have, more and more neo-nationalisms, new forms of racism, new forms of lack of solidarity. It's extremely relevant, that message, in a way, that we can change through the exchange with the other without losing or diluting my sense of self. On the contrary, by actually making our, sense of self much richer through this exchange. Glissant describes, for Martinique, being in contact with all the other islands around, and he says, that's what we can learn from this archipelago and apply it kind of on a daily basis. And of course, Glissant, you might wonder what that all has to do with Frida Escobedo, who's the youngest architect who ever designed the Serpentine Pavilion, and for Jana Peel and myself, our curator, Rebecca Lewin, also our advisors. We have with David Ache and Richard Rogers, two architects with us, with whom we think very regularly about which direction this pavilion scheme should go. And we felt it's very important over the last couple of years to open it up also to a younger emerging generation of architects. And of course the link to Glissant, because the amazing thing of Glissant is that there's all these toolboxes. There's the archipelago toolbox, which I use every day. There is also the toolbox of the right of opacity. Philippe Pareno made a t-shirt that we should claim that right to opacity. And I once asked Glissant to explain it to me, and he had a very beautiful explanation, because he basically says, I don't like broccoli. And I don't have to explain to you why. It's of no one's business. I just don't like broccoli, So he said, that is my right to opacity. It's a great example. He calls it the broccoli example. So anyway, there's the broccoli tool, the opacity thing, there's the archipelago thing, but then there is also mondialité. And mondialité kind of leads us to Frida Escobedo. Because of course, Frida developed this pavilion. Some of you might have already seen it at the Serpentine, and it's basically in Kensington Gardens. And she used, of course, very strong connections to Mexico. So she connected it to the Gelosia, which are these amazing, walls, which are somehow semi-transparent, and according to where you stand and where you are, according to your position in the pavilion, all of a sudden they actually become opaque. So you see through them and not through them, according to where you are. But they are not made out of the material you would make them in Mexico, but they're actually made out of these tiles, which are used for roofs in England. So they're made with an extremely local, material. And at the same time, we've got lots of optics involved. It's a pavilion. The pavilion is also a selfie machine. Talking about selfies, to come back to Doug's presentation, because of course, the optics of the ceiling, the mirroring ceiling, it's one of the so far most photographed pavilion. You've also got the water reflecting surface, which leads, to endless photographs. And there was a very wonderful photo shoot the day before the opening of the two Fridas. Because actually Selma Hayek came to meet Frida Escobedo, and of course you all know the film, Frida Kahlo of Selma Hayek, and then at the same time you have of course Frida Escobedo, the architect, and then you have Frida's wonderful painting of Frida holding the hand of Frida, which is very connected to the theme of our talk tonight, because you've got Frida as a cosmopolitan artist. I almost said architect, Frida Kahlo. It's a Versprecher, it's a slippage. So it's Frida Kahlo not as a cosmopolitan architect, but as a cosmopolitan artist, and Frida Kahlo as a very Mexican artist. It's got the two Fridas. So this great photograph, you can see it on my Instagram, of the two Fridas, Frida Escobedo and Selma Hayek, holding hand, in the pavilion. Now, the mondialité trope of Glissant, which is, besides opacity and archipelago, one of his main toolboxes. Mondialité would be mondiality in English, and it's kind of a global dialogue which does not annihilate difference, but which produces difference. Because Glissant early on understood, and something it might appear to you very obvious, and today it is very obvious because we see it all around us. But when Glissant developed the theme in the 60s and 70s, it wasn't obvious at all, because he saw globalization come, and it's of course not the first time the world experiences globalization. We had already globalization in the Roman Empire, but it's certainly the most extreme form of globalization, and maybe to some extent also the most violent form of globalization through technology. And so Glissant predicted that globalization, that extreme form of globalization would lead to all kinds of forces, homogenizing forces which would erode difference and ultimately lead to extinction. The mass extinction, Elizabeth Kolbert talks about the 6th mass extinction we are now living. The other day, I had dinner with Jg Ballard, the great writer, and she all of a sudden, out of the blue, looked at me and said, "When is the last time you have seen a centipede?" And silence was in the room. And of course, it's not only extinction of centipedes and extinction of bees, mass extinction of bees. There is also the potential extinction of our own species, which is why Gustav Metzger always said, we shouldn't talk about climate change, but we should talk about extinction. Only then, people would wake up. So Glissant saw early on that the homogenizing forces of globalization will lead to extinction, but he saw, and that's even more astonishing, already in the 60s, 70s, understood that the counter-reaction to these homogenizing forces of globalization will be as bad, and that will be that counter-reaction which will actually reject the global dialogue, and will be new forms of nationalism, new forms of lack of solidarity, new forms of racism, and basically he said we need to find a way to reject the homogenizing force of globalization and to reject these counter-reaction, because he says the violent globalization will lead to a very violent counter-reaction, which is this whole horrible form of neo-populism, right-wing populism we can now see all over the world. So he said we need to resist both of that, and we need to come up with mondialité, which is a global dialogue. It embraces the global dialogue, but it is aware of local differences, and it's also maybe no longer a manifesto, because the 20th century was all about making loud manifestos, but it's maybe more about the quality also of listening, to be able to listen. So all of that is mondialité, and in a way, Frida's Pavilion is very much about that. It has to do with listening to the local context. She spent a lot of time in the park. She connects it not only to the local context, she connects it to the meridian, to 1851, which is the year the meridian was defined, in London, but it's also the year when the Crystal Palace was built. It's the year of the Great Exhibition, and created this amazing hybrid structure, which is kind of both Mexican and London, and it's, is very rooted, yet creates a global dialogue. It's an application almost of the Glissantian trope of mondialité. And difficult to photograph, so best for those of you who haven't visited, if you can just come and experience it. It's also very interesting that there are all these niches, so it's in a way that hasn't happened with the pavilion before, but there are all these kind of places where you can actually hide, where you can just have a small meeting with a few people, so she created within the pavilion, which is such a public structure. It's the most, besides the Architecture Biennale, the most visited architecture show in the world. It's got hundreds of thousands of visitors every summer. But she created within that almost like spaces of intimacy, in a way. When you go behind into these spaces, you have small meeting spaces, and then you have the big...
Could I ask you, Hans-Ulrich, over these... Is this the 18th pavilion now?
Yeah.
18th. Would you... have each of the architects dealt with the question of, whether the pavilion is a space for kind of thriving crowds, or a space for, individual reflection in very different ways? And how is that kind of scripted into the brief? I mean, I'm sure we'd all be very interested in how you frame the brief to each architect each year. How does that happen?
Yeah, I mean the brief, because I think the interesting thing also about pavilions is that they kind of can allow experiments, which maybe permanent buildings, can't allow. So we need to keep the brief in a way as simple as possible, and that's how it was defined in 2000 when Zaha Hadid and Julia Peyton-Jones, started the scheme. Yeah. In the year 2000, it was the first pavilion. We should also not forget that was the first structure of Zaha built, in this country. As unbelievable as it might appear that the pavilion within 2006 with REM was the first thing REM ever built in this country. So we've got, it just shows you to which extent the architecture here has been insular in terms of built architecture, not in terms of discourse, because it's always been an amazingly global discourse, particularly in this very place here. But paradoxically, the built reality has been so unbelievably insular. And the scheme, of course, we go back to mondialité, we go back to Glissant. The purpose of this scheme from the very beginning was to create an open, global dialogue in the UK, for architecture. But the brief is extremely simple. I mean, there has to be a roof, so there has to be a situation. One architect once didn't want to build a roof. He said he just wanted a pavilion without a roof. So that's, I think, the only time we could not build it, because there has to be, given the weather here, and given also the fact that it's used for, because it's extremely densely used. It's used for lectures, it's used for conferences, it's used for film screenings. Artists can take it over. It's also used for gatherings, particularly when it rains. People find shelter in the park. Joggers come early in the morning. It's always interesting to see how the joggers use it. And it's not only humans. Also, there are, of course, the many dogs and bats and etc. So all kinds of interactions, to occur. So it's a very simple brief, and the brief is kept so simple that basically, there has to be a possibility to seat, 200 people so that we can do these events. So there has to be the possibility of this flexibility, so that and there has, of course, to be the possibility for people to have a coffee. So there is some form of, coffee bar, so people can have a coffee or a tea if they want, but people are not obliged to consume, because it's very important that it's in that sense, truly public space. And then I think one of the really key things of the brief is, because the pavilion is never thrown away. The idea is that it's recycled and that it finds a second home. So, for example, the Su Fujimoto Pavilion is now in Tirana with our friend, the Prime Minister, Edi Rama. It's very interesting that the Prime Minister of Albania is an artist. It's one of the few artist-run countries in the world. There should be more. And so Edi Rama, as one of the first acts when he became Prime Minister, he got the Su Fujimoto Pavilion, which belongs to the Luma Foundation, to Tirana, and installed it there. But Shumon wanted to talk to me in relation to what Doug was telling us. He wanted to talk to me about two exhibitions where we explored AI at the Serpentine and also digital technology. On the one hand, Ian Chang, where we had the digital commission, The Bad Corgi, which was curated by Ben Vickers. It's a corgi which never obeys. It's a kind of a disobedient corgi. And it's interesting because Ian works with simulating, world. And it's interesting when we think about that, for the most part, the works of contemporary artists have been embodied ruminations on AI's impact on existential questions of the self, to come back to the theme, and our future interaction with non-human entities. Few artists, however, have taken the technologies and innovations of AI as the underlying materials of their work and sculpted them to their own vision. And an exception in that is clearly, the wonderful Ian Chang, who his exhibition Emissaries is here, who has gone as far as to construct entire worlds of artificial beings with varying degrees of sentience and intelligence. He refers to these worlds as live simulations. His Emissaries trilogy, 2015 to 2017, which was for the first time here in Europe presented together in the exhibition at the Serpentine, is set in a fictional post-apocalyptic world of flora and fauna in which AI-driven animals and creatures explore the landscape and interact with each other. So Ian uses advanced graphics, and he uses also programs of those with a lot of glitches and imperfections, which imparts a futuristic and also anachronistic atmosphere at the same time, as you can see here. So through his trilogy, which charts a history of consciousness, he asks the question, what is a simulation? And while the majority of artistic works that utilize recent developments in AI actually specifically draw from the field of machine learning, Ian's live simulation take a separate route. The protagonists and plot lines that are interlaced in each episodic simulation of Emissaries use the complex logic systems and rules of AI. What is profound about his continually evolving scenes is that complexity arises not through the desire actions of any single actor or artificial, godhead, not some kind of super ego or super figure, who would program that, but instead through their constellation, through their collision and constant evolution in symbiosis with one another. So it's that interdependence in a way, which forms the work. So that gives rise to unexpected outcomes and unending, unknowable situations. You can never experience the exact same moment in successive viewings of his work. So even if you see the work with Ian himself, with the artist himself, he keeps discovering situations he would never have expected. So it's interesting that in our marathon, because we did a marathon last year at the Serpentine, which you can see online, which deals a lot, with questions of the self in the age of AI. It's the marathon actually about the guest, the ghost, the host, and the machine. So it's of course very Duchampian because Marcel Duchamp, asked that question of the guest, the host, the ghost, and we ask several questions. Is art changing in the age of AI? We could say, is architecture changing in the age of AI? What are the emerging relationships between machines and the human spirit? If we don't know what consciousness is, how can we qualify intelligence? Are we too late to define the ethics of our machines? A fairly urgent question. And also, does the future belong to non-human entities? And last but not least, is the existential threat real? So we also involved the programmer Richard Evans, who works on DeepMind, and he recently designed Versu, an AI-based platform for interactive storytelling games. And Evans' work emphasizes the social interaction of the game's characters who react in a spectrum of possible behaviors to the choices made by the human players. So in a conversation which Evans had actually with Ian, he said that the starting point for the project was that most earlier simulation video games, such as The Sims, did not sufficiently take into account the importance of social practices. So it's kind of interesting that both Ian and him thinks, if we want to think about AI and not fall into AS, because Hito Steil rightly says artificial intelligence can easily become artificial stupidity, then we need to think about what are the social practices, what is the social dimension of these models which are tested here. So simulated protagonists in games would often act in ways that did not correspond well with real human behavior. Knowledge of social practices limits the possibilities of action, but is necessary to understand the meaning of our action. So that is what interests Ian for his own simulation, which you see now. The more parameters of actions in certain circumstances are determined in a computer simulation, the more interesting it is for Chang to experiment with individual and specific changes. He told Evans, I gather that if we had AI with more ability to respond to social context, tweaking one thing, you would get something quite artistic and beautiful. So which is kind of an interesting idea, right? So you could tweak just one little thing and then something amazing could happen. Chang sees the work of programmers and AI simulations as creating new and sophisticated tools for experimenting with the parameters of our daily social practices. In this way, the involvement of artists in AI will lead to new kinds of open experiments in art. So we can ask ourselves, what will be the new experiments in art and technology given those technologies? Because in the 60s we had Billy Kluver, and he did experiments in art and technology with Bell's Lab, and it's very interesting that actually here, very near the AA, a few meters away from here, is the amazing Acute laboratory, ACUTE, Acute, which is a project where the most advanced virtual reality experiment actually of artists in the world today are being experimented on a very regular basis. Amazing artists are visiting. Marina Abramovic was just here. And that is really literally just next door to here. Basically, Acute and AA are neighbors, so maybe that is interesting as a potential to make that neighborhood fruitful. So it's interesting in terms of possibilities, like increased AI capabilities in general. They still seem to lie in the future, so recognizing that this is an experimental technology in its infancy, which is very far from, apocalyptic visions of super intelligent AI takeovers, Chang fills his simulation with prosaic avatars, such as strange microbial kind of globules, dogs, and the undead, as you can see here. And that, of course, leads us right away. Here you have more of Ian. He developed also a character. I don't know if we have this character somewhere here in the images. They're somehow slightly disordered. Here we have it. It's a character called Bob. So Bob, it's the house that Jack built. It's the house that Doug built. And here we have the house that Bob built. And Bob is basically an AI character. And it stands for bag of belief. So Bob is the answer. What is the question? Bob is Bob. Everything else is everything else. It's a Bob world after all. And so it was very fascinating because for the visitors of the Serpentine, this was really a new experiment in terms of how you encounter an artwork, because you're usually, you're used to the fact that this artwork is there for you. And I was reading last night actually the guest book, the digital guest book and the analog guest book, where people, put the visitor comments into the guest book. And it was super fascinating to see that, somebody, for example, example, wrote, I came all the way from Birmingham and Bob was sleepy and didn't want to talk to me. So, devastated comment by someone who just could not understand why Bob was not responsive. Something, we are not surprised when we go to the zoo, because we expect animals necessarily to be moody, but we would not then expect an artwork. And then, somebody said, Bob was in such a bad mood, and then obviously this amazing thing happened that all of a sudden, once in the middle of the night, we got a phone call that the gallery had lit up, because you could see Bob when Bob was, because Bob was supposed to be asleep at night. It was programmed that Bob would wake up at 10 in the morning and then be there until 7 p.m. And at night, the gallery would not be lit. But all of a sudden at 4 in the morning, we got noticed that the gallery had lit up because Bob had decided to wake up earlier. So anyway, that's the way it is with the house that Bob built. And I'm also going to talk a little bit...
sorry, we're just a bit mindful of time.
Yeah, I'm not going to talk about Sondra because we can do that at the very end, so we should open up. No?
So please, a round of applause for Hans-Ulrich. I have a few questions ready, but I do want to open up to you. We've got about maximum, we've got 5-10 minutes, and then we'll call it a day. It's obviously very, very hot.
So it's not a marathon?
It's not a marathon.
I hope it will be a marathon.
Sorry. If you have a question, if you put your hand up and wait for the microphone, that would be great. But maybe while you're stewing over that, I want to ask both of you actually something that we discussed with Sophia 2 days ago, which is that the history of AI has largely, up until quite recently, been measured through what you could say are like computationally complex tests. Right? So the famous case of Garry Kasparov and the Big Blue, of Deep Blue, sorry, and then recently of AlphaGo by Google. And in both cases, they're obviously landmark thresholds that are being passed. But some people might sort of say, okay, well that's fine because these are both chess and Go are effectively computationally, mathematically complex systems of cause and effect, of act and counteraction. And yeah, of course, a computer is going to be smarter than a human because it's able to crunch the numbers a lot more. But the one thing that still again defines us, thinking about continents or archipelagos, that protects us as a continent is something like creativity. Now, I wonder how each of you feel about this idea that creativity, and particularly in this context, something like artistic creativity, remains to be the sort of one of the defining privileges that we believe we have, and that we believe machines don't have and maybe will never have. So, Hans-Ulrich, to start with you, was Bob creative? Did Bob possess creativity?
I mean, Bob is in its infancy, and as Ian said, it's a beginning. But there were many moments of great surprise. Yeah.
But that's interesting. I mean, is surprise a key aspect of creativity? Do you think?
But I think it's far too early to say. I mean, that would be like if you would have a 6-month-old baby, and you would wonder if the baby, is an artist or something. That's what Ian would answer, because it's literally just begun, and he's going to let that work evolve over the next. He's now working on the second iteration for January, and he's going to let it evolve. I mean, I think it's also interesting this idea when an artwork is alive. And I think it's still completely impossible, of course, that this work could be born without the artist, because of course Ian creates the work. It isn't in that sense Bob who is creative. It's a work by Ian. But I think what is interesting is that the work has its own life. Also the simulations you saw, as long as there is electricity, they're going to change. So we're in a completely different set here, in a completely different definition of an artwork. The artwork is never going to twice repeat. We are not in the loop age anymore. It's not the loop. This piece will always be different. And the same thing is true for Bob. Bob might be there in 50 or 100 years, and it's really an evolutive artwork, which is alive.
Sophia had said that maybe the ultimate Turing test isn't for consciousness, but for empathy. And is it possible for AI to emulate empathy? I mean, I've got an iPhone here. Most of you probably do as well. And someone sends me a text, and it auto-suggests the most chillingly appropriate replies, okay, call me in 2.5 days, and I'll tell you how much we need to order. And as time goes by, even in the last year, it's getting ever more precise in how it can anticipate me what I want. And that's just a tiny little algorithm on this, an app of an app of an app. We're getting there very, very quickly.
How fundamental is creativity to our notion of self? And if that was something that were also to be no longer our unique privilege or quality, is that a loss of self to us?
I mean, creativity is a continuum, not a threshold. I know a lot of people who say, I am not creative. You do what you do, but I'm not creative. And so if they're not creative, what are they? And you have to redefine creativity, blah, blah, blah. I actually believe machines are going to create stuff, and probably way sooner than we think. I'm not the slightest bit of doubt in my mind. So maybe creativity is another one of those human capacities that just bites the dust.
Yeah. Any questions over here and here? We'll start over here. Let's get the microphone down here. Quick, can you pass that around, please? Keep your questions short and questions. Thank you.
I just want to point something out. It was just a detail, and it's sort of a question about the facial recognition. My recollection is that maybe the day after 9/11 was when it was on the news all the time about how it had been in place in some of the airports and in a very crude way and had failed. And that's from my memory. And that also reminds me that one of Doug's earliest uses of the yearbooks was just darkened pictures, kind of a memorial. And then that reminded me that were the yearbooks one of your first, they were all enabled, your ability to collect them was enabled by eBay, was it not?
I love eBay.
And then this is I had a harder question, but I wanted to ask Doug if one of the most interesting activities, I think, that made me rethink a person's relationship to the internet was, and maybe you want to mention how you came to collect meteorites.
Oh.
And that, to me, that's something about a relationship to self and technology and maybe eBay as well.
I will keep this very, very okay. Yes, I collect meteorites, and I collect them because I can, and I collect them because they're from all over the universe, and who knows what's inside them if you cut them in half. I always wonder, okay, what if Andy Warhol hadn't died and he was alive in the age of eBay? I think he'd just live online. I think he'd just go shopping 24 hours a day.
Start as a rumor that you read online.
Do what? Yes.
That's the part that...
That was an early web rumor that I collect meteorites. And then I thought about it. That's actually a really good idea. And so thank you for that.
Over here.
Doug, you mentioned two very interesting ideas in the beginning, right here. The first is, one is not taking yourself too seriously, but then two, when describing the fireman sculpture in the beginning, you described it as a UFO that came down to you in almost like an accidental piece of work, which I found very interesting. And so my question is, do you find it important to separate the art from the artist? Because that's something that is heavily debated by some artists, describing the ghost in the wall that comes out and influences their craft.
Well, I mean, even going back to art school, that was always a big question in the studio. It was like so-and-so is a real dick. I don't know if I can like their work or not. And I think it is harder when you know someone socially to make that sort of separation. I think art comes in two forms. Well, writing comes in two forms, fiction and nonfiction. And art comes in two forms, which is studio art, and then there's things like public art, or art that's sort of grounded or tethered, as is nonfiction, in some aspect of reality. And I think that you have those four quadrants of verbal and visual creativity, and I sort of cycle through them. And so what applies to one quadrant maybe doesn't apply at all to another. I don't know if that answers your question. What was the UFO? Sorry, that happens to me a lot, actually.
I think you described that your sculpture work is almost accidental in a way, and it was kind of like
Public
a UFO coming down.
Public work.
Public sculpture work. Almost like a UFO coming down to.
It sounds
maybe
really
that's
bad, but everything in my life is like a UFO arriving. I don't necessarily believe in UFOs. I think life is everywhere in the universe, but I don't believe in UFOs. I'm open to everything. Unless you leave yourself open to everything, I don't think that anything's going to happen. We need to have a drink afterwards on that one.
I thought that Frida's pavilion sounded like it was a very good proponent of Edouard Glissant's ideas, but I agree with you that it's something that should be spread in other parts of society. So I'm just going to skip to the next question. So how would you do that? And two, could you instrumentalize artificial intelligence to encourage people to get into that state of vulnerability where they, where they feel able to engage with other cultures without the fear of dissolving?
And Ulrich?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many ways. I think it's a very interesting question. Thank you. And there are many ways how we can, try to do that. I mean, one way that was not the AI solution. That was a very sort of 20th century way of doing it. Was that the other day, because you mentioned the Nuit Blanche, and there's also such a Nuit Blanche in Paris where hundreds of thousands of people, go and look at art. So we used the entire budget when my friend Chiara Parisi did this night for my project, instead of doing a big exhibition, to print hundreds of thousands of little booklets of Edouard Glissant, so that every single person living in Paris would get such a book. So that was a way of, disseminating this idea. But it's interesting, in terms of AI, how one could actually start to bring these things into programs, so that actually they would not produce homogenized globalization, but they would produce mondialité. Because obviously Ian said the other day in a conversation we did about Bob and about AI, and we have to kind of find a way also of bringing in benevolence in such system and not malevolence, because it can go either way, and if it goes wrong, a Trump comes out, and otherwise maybe a Dalai Lama comes out, Ian said, and I think, so that ties in somehow with your question, but again, it's something, we'd have to ask Ben Vickers, because I'm not, understanding exactly how it functions with AI. I'm just, starting to learn.
I'm going to use my executive privilege here to ask the last question. And it's to both of you, but in a way it's inspired by you, Hans-Ulrich. As I mentioned in the introduction, you have many, many, many rituals, and you have continued these many, many rituals for many, many years. What is it about rituals and the self that is so important, and what is the relationship between these two things?
No, I mean, the question is, I was thinking, because we should really talk about about our new ritual, which is this ritual of writing this book together, the three of us, because it's about to become a ritual, and for me, it's something, very, very new, because I've been co-curating a lot of shows and writing a lot of texts, with colleagues, and in ping pong situations where we would be two, in the of the Deleuze-Guattari model, that two people do something together. But for me, it's really the first time I do that. And I think in terms of curating, it's slightly more frequent. You often have shows written by, curated by 3 curators, like biennales with 3, 4, 5 colleagues. But in terms of books, it's relatively rare. So I wanted to ask Doug to tell us about this idea of what it means, to write with someone else and for someone else and with someone else. And, because I think it's we sort of said at the beginning, we talk about that we haven't done it yet.
Very quickly, 2 years back, we were talking, and we all realized that Eric Hobsbawm, the historian, was one of our favorite writers. And then we all agreed that The Age of Extremes was probably our favorite book of his. And then we were talking about, how do you look at the 21st century, and what if you were to take The Age of Extremes, which began with World War I and ended with the collapse of communism, and use the 19 chapters in that book as a framework for addressing the 21st century. And so then, each of us has a different superpower, I think. We all brought different capes to the table. And there's something really joyful about working with other people, as long as you're not paranoid, and you have to realize that they're out there to make you look good as well as themselves, and they're out there to do the right thing. In literature, sometimes there are writers who can't take editing, and that's really bad advice, because an editor there, as long as you trust them, is there to make you look good. And I think what happens with the 3 of us in these books is that, you forgot about this, remember that, and it's sort of, we create this 4th entity called this book, and it just works. I don't want to overthink it, actually.
It's true that writing has always been, and maybe continues to be, this sort of protected province of singular authorship. There are examples of books that are co-written. Even when William Burroughs wrote with Geisen, for example, it was alternate chapters. There are, but this is where the Deleuze and Guattari, I think, model is really interesting, because to borrow Hans-Ulrich and Julia's equation, the 1 + 1 = 11. There's a way in which they manage to efface each other. And actually, we discussed Deleuze and Guattari as a couple format 2 years ago with Aaron Schuster. So I do urge you to look this up, because, Aaron's description of that relationship. So Deleuze is someone who is, in a way, a very traditional kind of traditional philosopher who believed in solitude, in somehow retreat from, the worst thing for him was to be invited to a dinner party. He absolutely hated it. He just wanted to stay at home, read his books, or teach. So the most collective space for Deleuze was the classroom. But then he was introduced to Guattari, and Guattari, had initiated this whole new kind of school of therapy at Laborde, which goes through Freud, through Lacan. But his critique of psychoanalysis was that it was not enough, that there was a one-on-one relationship between the analyst and the analysand, and so one needed to break out of this into group therapy, and the group as a kind of potential of energy that is maybe an anarchic energy, and so these two met each other, and in a way they're absolutely diametrically opposed to each other on the conceptual spectrum, but completely enthralled with the other. And then Aaron basically says that throughout the 20 years of working and writing together, what kept their relationship going, what kept it never self-combusting, which, as we know from all collaborations, or indeed all relationships, and certainly all forms of love, the thing that can bring you together is often the thing that will tear you apart. In their case, they never attempted to they never attempted to convince the other of their position. So there was a sense in which Deleuze was always resilient about his position, his radical solitude, his radical kind of isolation, and in Guattari's case, of the collective. But there was a kind of mutual fascination, and Aaron sort of describes this as a form of love which is mutually compatible symptoms. And I think it's a really beautiful description of love, and it's a very beautiful description of how people can come together. And actually goes back to what you were saying with Glissant, this idea of how to, in a sense, perform alterity without having to surrender who you are and to become the other. Right, so it's a very kind of precarious sort of psychostructure, but I think it's one that Deleuze and Guattari are one of the few examples that I can think of where their authorship is subsumed and creates something else. And I think, lastly, I mean, just to wrap things up, I think in our case, the format of the books that we use, which where authorship just begins with us, but in fact goes in many, many, many tentacular directions. In the same way, I mean, the question that kept coming up with when our book came out was that, so which of you did which part? You know, like, and which says so much about people's idea of authorship today, right? Like, so they wanted to know that, okay, so Hans-Ulrich did page 92, and then Doug did page 103, and then I sort of came in at 156. And you know, turn around and say, well, okay, who wrote the internet? Right, so no one sort of turns around and goes, well, I wonder who wrote which part of the internet, right? Like, there's this idea that the internet is already way beyond any singularity, any multitude. It's, you know, its notion of authorship exceeds all of these categories. But when it comes to books, we're still extremely conservative and extremely backwards looking. And I mean, I hope that I hope our book and many books that are happening today inspire other people to find new forms of authorship, because it's 50 years since Roland Barthes said the author was dead. And it seems one of the persistent kind of fetishes of subjectivity that the author should continue to survive. Any last few words before we wrap things up?
It creates a chain reaction also, I think, between us, which is kind of fascinating, where, you know, the book is one possibility which is surrounded by many other possibilities worthwhile being explored. And, you know, at the moment it's also going to be an exhibition, but who knows what else, you know, it's going to become. And this chain reaction, I mean, and I have difficulties to concentrate because I'm really still thinking about your question about Glissant, because it's one of the best questions I've been asking a long, long time, because we need to find that Glissant algorithm. It could save the world. So I'm going to speak to AI experts tonight. It's such a good question.
Such a good question.
So I have difficulty to concentrate because I'm totally into that thought. But so thank you again for this question. But the thing, for example, which was also fascinating with this process is, so I've got this ritual that whenever I'm in a city, you know, I would visit very old, wise people. And that's something Rosemarie Trockel told me when I was very young. So I was like 16, 17, I started to visit this artist. And so I went to the studio of Rosemarie Trockel, and she said, you know, I have this idea, which I don't have the time to do, and you're young, so you can do it. You can basically you should just go and visit very old people and learn their wisdom. So you should go to every city in the world and say, who is the Louis Bourgeois in town? Or who is the, you know, the great, wise, amazing old artist or philosopher. And I've done it ever since, and I've never stopped doing it. I was arrived somewhere and asked, you know, who is this wise person I can learn from? And so, you know, in Paris, it's Ethel Nan, the great poet whom you mentioned. She has been a great inspiration, or Edouard Glissant. And then in 2006, I moved to London. So I was asking everybody, all my friends in London, and, you know, who is the great, wise person from whom I can learn? And so I was given lots of different names. And of course, one name I was given immediately is Eric Hobsbawm, whom you quoted, the late historian who was then in his late 80s. And so I would go to Hampstead every third, fourth week, you know, and spend an afternoon with him. And so the amazing thing is we started to talk about volume 2 of our book, and all of a sudden Doug and Shumon, you know, would start to talk about Eric Hobsbawm. And, you know, and I have this whole archive which is unused. And so it's a chain reaction of some sort. So it's Rupert Sheldrake would call it a morphogenetic field. I don't know.
Okay.
We have run out of time. We've possibly run out of oxygen in this room as well. Okay. But hopefully it's been nourishing in many, many ways. Before I ask you to thank our guests, just to remind you that the third session of Self Format is next Wednesday, the 11th of July. We have the amazing writer Adam Thirlwell, who I got to know through Hans-Ulrich, and also Jack Self, who is a AA alumni, a curator, a writer, and also a very interesting cultural critic. So that's here. Hopefully it'll might be less oppressive weather-wise, at 6:30. And then the last one is next Friday with Olivia Sujic and Brendan McKettrick. So will you please join me in thanking Douglas Coupland and Hans-Ulrich Obrist.
And also, if you could kindly give a very big round of applause for the great Shumon Basar.
Yay!